And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Scott, and he'll share his expertise on the latest trend in drug screening, oral fluid testing.
Thank you, Alexis, and thank you to our marketing team. And most importantly, thank you all for joining. I would say that with the questions that we get here at ESS about many things, I would say oral fluid testing is probably in our top 3 to 5 most asked questions. So we've had a lot of new clients and prospective clients that have been asked about oral fluid testing, so we thought it would be a good time to present a webinar on oral fluid, especially for the beginning part of it, just like an introductory type webinar. So thank you again for joining. So what is oral fluid testing? It's been around for a little while, but I would say in recent years it's had a push just to better serve the drug testing community. So it's a little bit fresher to a lot of employers and things. So I want to talk a little bit about what it is. One thing that I won't talk about too much are a couple things. One is the legal aspect, because most legal things need to go through an employer's attorney who needs to be familiar with your drug testing program. We have attorneys on staff here who help us with those legal questions too. So I'm not an attorney, so I don't want to get into legal things. And with this being an introductory webinar on oral fluid testing, I don't want to get too technical. I want to keep it more high scale and kind of go over some of the most asked questions and things like that in the process. Okay, so what is oral fluid testing? Oral fluid is basically saliva. So traditionally, when drug testing first came about in the late 80s and 90s for employers, urine was the most acceptable standard, and it's still considered the gold standard because it's what most employers use. But oral fluid is used in saliva. So it comes from the salivary glands, and you're collecting a sample just like a urine sample, which is packaged up and sent into the laboratory. One small difference from the urine sample is it is an observed collection. Urine samples can be observed under certain circumstances, but oral fluid is observed every time because it allows the donor to have control of their sample with the collector in front of them. So the collector actually is giving the person basically a saliva collection device, and they're putting it in their mouth. So the whole process is observed. As far as the testing process, and let me make sure that everybody understands, we're discussing oral fluid laboratory testing. So with that being said, the traditional testing process is still in effect. You're going to have a collection with the chain of custody. You're going to have a screening to screen for drugs. If there's any non-negatives or any issues, then there is a confirmation. Here at ESS, we always use a medical review officer for any non-negatives or anything that may need to go through a doctor for an interview with the employee, such as prescriptions and so forth. So it's very similar in the process as urine and even the hair testing as far as the general overview. As far as legal considerations, again, I'm not going to go in depth on any legal considerations or anything like that, but as of today, it is not approved for regulated testing, which is the federal guidelines, which really encompasses like your DOT employers, like truck drivers, airlines, bus drivers, the Coast Guard, pipeline, FTA, and the railroad, things of that nature. Some states do have restrictions and prohibit the practice completely. So there are some states that don't allow for oral fluid. But again, I don't want to go in depth on those things. Okay, so what do employers need to know? Let's talk about some of those things. The testing process, as I mentioned, is very similar to urine and hair testing. It does start with the chain of custody, is what is typically called, but it's a custody and control form process. And the oral fluid lab testing is the same, as I mentioned, like urine and hair. So you're filling out donor information. The company information will have employer information, so the laboratory knows how to report the sample, what test is being conducted, and things like that. So every employer has an account set up, and the laboratory knows how to report it. They know who the MRO is, and they get the donor information. So the custody and control form includes the donor's name, their phone number, date of birth, employee ID number, and so forth, just to make sure the MRO has information on the donor so he can do a donor interview if needed, and the employer also has that donor's information when it's reported. It does still have the reasons for tests like pre-employment or reasonable cause, post-accident, and so forth. It does still have the collector information, so you know who the collector that facilitates this process is. Okay, some of the testing challenges that you may see, which I would say through experience, we haven't seen a lot of this, but it can play a factor. With it being an oral fluid collection, dry mouth can play a factor. So if you have dry mouth or a donor has dry mouth, it may take a little longer to collect a sample. Some medications, such as benzodiazepines, come to mind that creates a dry mouth type effect. So that can take a little longer to collect a sample. Dehydration, if you're dehydrated like you're an athlete, not drinking enough water, or you're working in a construction or whatever, and it may be hot, you get dehydrated, that can be a challenge. And also swallowing more frequently or talking. We're going to go over the collection process in this, so we'll talk a little bit more about this, but when a person puts the swab in their mouth, the collector is going to ask them not to talk and not to swallow too much because we're trying to collect a sample from that device. Okay, so this is one thing that really comes up a lot with question, and it's general detection times. So I want to kind of include the three different main testing methods for drugs of abuse, which is oral fluid testing, urine testing, and hair testing. There are three detection time differences with the three devices. So I want to go a little more in depth in that. Oral fluid is soon after ingestion. So if you've taken in a drug, pretty soon after that, it gets into the oral fluid sample. So from that moment of ingestion or soon after the ingestion, up to 24 to 48 hours, there's a window there that it's capturing that drug use. So basically, moment of ingestion up to 24 to 48 hours. That's a little bit different than the urine. Urine, it takes about a day, I would say 12 hours to 24 hours to actually get into a urine sample. So just to make sure you're clear, let's take marijuana, for example. If someone smoked marijuana on the way to the job and they're tested as soon as they get there, then it could potentially not show up in a urine sample because it does take time to get in the sample. Now, most drugs stay in the system in a urine sample from 24 to 72 hours. That's a general window. So there are some drugs that can stay in a little longer. The most common is marijuana. Marijuana, if it's one-time use, then yes, you're looking at that recent 24 to 72 hour window. But if someone is a frequent user, maybe using every day, multiple times a day or whatever, it can stay in the system up to 30 days. And then we have hair testing. Hair testing, it takes typically about a week for drugs to get into the system and into the hair follicle. So if they've used drugs before that week time period, it may not show up at hair test. But once it does show up after that week, it can stay into a hair sample up to 90 days, or I should say can be tested up to a 90-day window. And just to go into a little more detail with the hair testing, Typical rule of thumb is a hair test is going to be a hair sample that's taken from the head, and the collection is going to try to get 1.5 inches of hair, and it goes back 30 days for every 1/2 inch. So if they only are collecting a 1/2 inch of hair, then that's a 30-day window. If it's 1 inch of hair, that's a 60-day window. If it's the full 1.5 inches, then you're going back 90 days. So again, it's a week to 90 days. Okay, so what are some of the benefits of oral fluid testing? A small sample is required. For urine testing, there is a minimum volume, and same with hair. There's a certain volume that you have to get. Oral fluid of the three is the least amount of volume that you need, and it's a lot easier to collect. Another huge benefit, I mean, this is probably one of the biggest benefits, is the observed collection. Today, we have seen through years and years of research and testing and things of that nature, it's a constant battle where the laboratory's coming up with testing for adulterants. So if a donor goes on the internet and buys a product to try to beat a test, then the laboratory is testing for those things if your account is set up to test for them, to try to catch those things, and you may get an adulterated test, meaning they have tampered with their sample by buying something on the internet. But one of the most recent harder things to detect is synthetic urine. So synthetic urine is a urine product that's bought that has the same properties of urine, and if they can heat that up to the right temperature between 90 and 100 degrees, then that is the typical way a donor is trying to beat a test. With oral fluid, you don't have that case. The sample is observed. The donor's actually taking the swab, putting it in their mouth, collecting the sample, putting it back into the tube, and the collector is going to finish the process. It is tamper resistant, so they can't buy things on the internet to try to beat it like a urine test. There's nothing that you can put in your mouth, and I'll say that with a caveat of saying that the collector has instructions to make sure that a person hasn't had anything in their mouth for 10 minutes. So as long as that's the case, then they're not putting anything in their mouth that could tamper with the test. And there's also a decreased likelihood of deception. So, with the urine process, there's a lot of things you try to do, like checking the temperature, checking the pockets, and things like that, but you can't check everything. So again, with the, observed collection, it's just a less likelihood of deception or trying to beat the test. Okay, so let's talk about the sample collection. One thing, I'm going to try to use the most typical device we talk about, but there are several different devices and different ways to collect the samples. So I'm going to go over the most common thing that is done by most labs. And then if you use a different type of device, feel free to ask questions at the end. So the oral fluid collection is very simple to perform. I will say that it's a lot better for employers that are considering collecting themselves than a urine test or a hair test. So let's talk about some of these sample collection benefits here. One thing it does is if the employer is willing to collect their own, it eliminates a collection fee. We see, I'm going to give a range of collection fees. That could be anywhere from, $12 to $15 on the low end to anywhere up to $45 to $50. That's just to collect it. That doesn't even include the testing fee. So collection fees can be quite exorbitant. So again, if you're as an employer or a school wanting to collect your own, it does eliminate some of those fees. It also eliminates gender-based collection. So if typically when you're doing a urine test and you're sending someone into a collection site, if it has to be observed for a urine, then you have to have same gender there. with the oral fluid test, genders don't really matter. It can be male or female. It also reduces the likelihood of the invasion of privacy factors. So, urine sample, a lot of people will call it the ick factor, or, the way it looks or smells, or things of that nature. And saliva just doesn't have those type of privacy issues. It also reduces productivity loss. So, the whole benefit to drug testing, and I know a lot of employers now are looking at reducing their drug testing or not even doing drug testing, which obviously we've seen a lot of benefit with drug testing, but one of those benefits is productivity. Oral fluid actually adds more productivity advantages there, because if you, the employer, are collecting those samples, then you have complete control. If you have a person that's on a job line, you can take them off for 5 to 10 minutes. They can give their sample. They can go right back to work. It takes away that liability of sending them into a collection site. So you kind of see where I'm going with this. The productivity and keeping the person on the job is much more effective with the oral fluid collection. So again, I've put this in here several times just to kind of beat home the benefit of an observed collection. The beating a drug test market out there has become huge. There's all kinds of products, there's all kinds of education and things out there for people that are trying to beat a test. It has become even more of a big business since some states have allowed recreational or medical use of marijuana. So with that being in play, then people see that it may be okay to do marijuana or medical marijuana or things of that nature. So then when they realize their company is still testing for that, then they're going to be looking for ways to try to get around it or beat the system. So again, beating a drug test is a big market out there. So oral fluid testing will help decrease those types of things. So sample collection, again, I'm going to go through some of these collection things just to kind of bring home the point. So there's no reason to worry about insufficient hair or shy bladders. So with hair testing, if you do that or ever heard stories about it, if a person's going to try to beat a hair test, really the only way for them to do that is to try to shave their head and get rid of body hair. So if they do that, then they're not going to have a hair sample to give. And obviously with urine testing, if you've done that and been doing it for any substantial amount of time, you probably know what shy bladder is, meaning that a person can't give a urine sample or they can't give it in a short period of time. So they may end up waiting a few hours to be able to give a sample. Okay, so let's go through the process time frame. So, another common question we get asked a lot from prospective employers or schools or current clients is, well, how long does it take for a drug test result to come back? So this is a really good slide to show you that oral fluid testing is basically the same as a urine test. The collection typically takes an average of 5 minutes. We typically use devices that have an indicator, which in those indicators, usually in 3 to 5 minutes, it collects enough saliva to turn blue. So there's an indicator that turns blue. For someone that has a little bit more trouble giving an oral fluid sample, the device's instructions is to wait 10 minutes and then package it up and send it in, even if the indicator doesn't turn blue. 10 minutes should be ample time to collect enough saliva sample. That has actually come up recently with one of our new clients that switched over from urine to oral fluid. They had a few cases where the indicator didn't turn blue, and they were concerned that it was lack of volume And with a quick call with the client, me and our team, we discuss with them the process and what the manufacturer instructions are, and they were totally fine with that after the fact, but they did have questions about it. So after the collection is done, it is packaged up just like a typical laboratory test, so it is sent to the lab overnight, and the laboratory begins a screening test. Those screening tests typically take 24 to 48 hours from negatives for the time the lab receives it. So again, it's just like a urine test. It takes about the same amount of time going through the screening process. If there's any issues with the screening test, for example, if it's non-negative, shows a type of drug or adulterant or something like that in it, then it's going to go on for confirmation testing. The confirmation testing may take an additional 24 to 72 hours for that testing. After the testing is done and the laboratory has valid results, the certifying scientist is going to release it to a medical review officer. So negatives, again, they're going to report out quickly. We can get those over to you. But if there's any issues with the testing, it's going to report to the MRO, and they're going to do an analysis. They're going to look at the chain of custody. They're going to look at the data provided by the lab, and they're going to do a donor interview. And they're going to look for things such as medications, prescriptions, and I'll say before that they are looking for valid prescriptions. So you can't take your spouse's or partner's medication. It does have to be your medication. It has to be within the expiration date and things of that nature. So he is going to validate those things through the pharmacy and or the prescription bottle. So after that process, he's going to report it over. Some of the delays we see with this process is actually just getting in touch with the donor. So the MRO is going to make a good faith attempt to the donor. Typically, and MROs vary a little bit in this procedure, but typically they're going to try to contact them 1 to 3 times with a 24-hour period. And if he can't get in touch with them, he's going to report out a non-contact positive or non-contact result. And then we're going to work with you to try to get a good phone number or have the donor call the MRO. Okay, so what are some of the typical drugs tested for in an oral fluid sample? Along with this presentation, we have some handouts, which includes a drugs abuse data sheet. So there's some information on these drugs in that handout. But the typical drugs tested for are your amphetamines and methamphetamines, cocaine, marijuana or TCH, PCP, and opiates, which includes the range of opiates that are tested, like with the DOT, which are codeine, morphine, hydrocodone, which is commonly called Loratab, is one of the prescriptions, hydromorphone, 6-AM, which is heroin, oxycodone, or commonly known as Oxycontin, or oxymorphone. So those are typically the drugs tested for. There are some drugs that you don't see there, like barbiturates and methaqualone and things like that. Those aren't typically tested in oral fluid testing. So one thing I will say, a handout of these slides are available also. So if you need to refer back to them for these drugs, that may be helpful for you. So let's go through the collection process. I wanted to include this because it does talk about the collection procedure, which is a little bit different than the urine test, but mostly the same thing. So we're going to talk about a little bit of the differences. So when a donor is in front of the collector to give a sample, they're going to be asked not to have anything in their mouth for 10 minutes. So that's just to make sure that they don't have anything in the mouth that could dilute the oral fluid sample. So 10 minutes is ample enough time to prevent that. So the collector is going to ask if they've had anything in their mouth or if they have anything in their mouth. Each one of the collection devices does have an expiration date. So the collector is going to read the package and confirm that the date is within the expiration date. A part of the process is collecting enough samples. So the donor, once they take the strip or the device and put it in their mouth, they're going to put it typically under their tongue and hold their mouth down. And I should say beforehand, they're going to try to move their tongue from back and forth to collect some saliva in their mouth. Then they're going to put the device in their mouth, under their tongue, and hold their head down, and it's going to start collecting that saliva on the strip. Again, we typically use a device that turns blue, so that helps with that process if they hold their head down. The collector is going to ask the donor not to chew on the device, talk, or remove the device until it turns blue or after 10 minutes. Turning blue means there's ample enough saliva, and 10 minutes is enough time to collect a sample if the device doesn't turn blue. Again, the sample is always, or the donor and the sample is being collected in front of the collector, so there's no chance for anything to get tampered with. Okay, so I'm big into statistics. I go into statistics a lot to look at trends and what's going on. And, I'm going to be honest with you guys. In the beginning, when oral fluid started, I wasn't very high on it. I was not a proponent of oral fluid testing, and it's really because the technology was not there. But over time, I was sold on the technology. The technology has come a long way. There's been a lot of research, development, studies, and statistics have proved to me that it is a viable testing option. It has really come a long way, and the statistics have shown that. So let's look at a few of these statistics. Okay, so the overall positivity rate in oral fluid testing. Okay, so this chart, and I'm very thankful for Quest Diagnostics because they do, a lot of research and studies, and Dr. Barry Sample with Quest Diagnostics does a great job of putting out these studies every year. So you can always look to the Quest website for more information on the statistics. But I did pull this statistic from them, and if you look at the beginning of the chart here, you can see back in 2007, the general overall positivity rate was only about 4.1%. But if you go back to 2017, a couple of years ago, it has increased into the 10.4% range. So there is a lot of positives being found by oral fluid testing. This is just my opinion by looking at data. I know Alexis called me an expert, and we only use that term simply because I've been in the business a long time and looked at a lot of statistics and had a lot of conversation with employers and schools. So back in 2007, looking at the statistical data between oral fluid and urine, I was not seeing a lot of positives, which, it gave me a lot of doubt in the process. Not that it wasn't totally a good device, but it just wasn't quite as good as urine. But looking at the recent years, it has really proved its point of being effective, and in my opinion is even more effective than urine. So we're going to talk about that a little more too. So let's go to our next slide and look at the annual positivity rate in urine. You can see that, let me go back and let you look at the oral fluid chart again, and just look at the lines there. Okay, now look at the urine positivity rate. It almost flips. For urine, back in the late 80s, 1990, you're looking at over a 10% positivity rate. In 1989, it was 13.6. Well, that was the very beginning of employers starting to do drug testing. So anytime an employer starts to do drug testing, you're going to have over a 10% positivity rate through findings that we've seen with new employers. So the positivity rate was higher. So as testing went on with urine, it started to decrease. Employees started to see that testing was going to happen. They're going to be tested. They quit using drugs or used it more limited, or they were being caught. But the statistics show that it's decreased to 4.2% in 2017. Okay, let me go back again. In 2007, 4.1% oral fluid. Now it's at 10.4. My opinion for that flip in these two things is because oral fluid is like a new type of drug testing. Or urine testing, donors have gotten used to it. They know they're going to be tested. Now employers are starting to switch to the oral fluid testing, and you're seeing those higher positivity rates. So you're actually catching more people. There's less chance for the donor to beat the test. So where the urine test shows this 4.2% positivity rate in 2017, some of that low rate may be from someone that has figured out a way to buy synthetic urine and found a way to heat up the sample and be able to beat the test. So oral fluid test eliminates that possibility. Now, I'm not bashing urine testing by any stretch. There's procedures in place like checking the temperature, the laboratory testing for adulterants, the collectors looking at the sample to make sure it doesn't look unusual, the color is appropriate, and things of that nature. The laboratory even tests for pH, specific gravity, and creatinine, which is typical in urine, human urine. So there are a lot of good safeguards in place for urine. So I'm not bashing urine testing by any stretch. I'm just saying that oral fluid is a new, effective way to help make sure that you're having a safe, productive workforce. Okay, so, in the beginning of oral fluid testing, one of the things that needed a little more development was in the marijuana testing part of the process. So marijuana was harder to catch, but it has come a long way. So back in 2013, there was about a 6.7% positivity rate in oral fluid for marijuana. And then in 2017, there was a 10.4% positivity rate. So anyway, this chart kind of goes into different percentages for the urine versus oral fluid versus hair. So pay attention to the blue line because that's the oral fluid testing, and you can kind of see by the chart how it is basically gone up and above the urine and the hair test as far as positivity rates. I think that's pretty powerful to look at. Okay, so another statistic is your opiates. We all know that there's a crisis in our country for opioids. So I did want to include a slide here that shows that oral fluid testing for opiates is similar to urine testing. So you're not losing anything by testing for opiates with the oral fluid test. This chart here just shows color codes of codeine, morphine, hydrocodone, and 6-AM or heroin. As you might expect, hydrocodone is your highest positivity rate with the opiates. And I would say that's because Loratab is probably your most abused of the opiates that is used for pain and so forth and things like that. And when we talk positivity rates, and someone may get hurt on the job or hurt at home, and maybe they're taking someone else's prescription for Loratab, those are a little more accessible than some of the other things. So that's why we see more higher rates for those type of things. Okay, so hopefully this has shed some light on some of the basic information on oral fluid testing. Again, we get a lot of questions for it, and I would like to turn it back over to Alexis and open up for questions because with a high level overview, it's hard to go over all the questions you may have, but hopefully we covered some. So with that being said, Alexis, let me know if you have any questions.
All right, thank you so much, Scott. So we do have a few questions coming in. The first is, I've heard that the DOT is going to allow for oral fluid testing. Is that true?
Yes, actually it is. As I mentioned, the research and development of oral fluid testing has gotten to the point now where it is a valid method. The DOT is right now in the process of approving the oral fluid to be a testing method, which could potentially come out next year, but I don't want to give any dates prematurely, but you should see that very soon with DOT federally mandated testing.
Okay. What are some of types of companies that are moving to oral fluid testing?
We've seen several different types of companies. And when we say companies, we think of employers, but we've seen a lot of school systems move to oral fluid testing. And the reason I want to mention that is because of the productivity thing. Students that are in class, when you take them out of class and you have a collector there, the student can come out of class for a few minutes and get back to class. Well, if you use that same theory with employers, it's the same. So if they're on the job and come off the job for 5 to 10 minutes, then they can get back to work. So if you think about production workers, manufacturers, things of that nature, we've seen a lot of that. We've seen a lot of employers with remote locations. So if you don't have a collection site for urine testing that's readily available, oral fluid is a good substitute for that. So it allows the employer to collect at their own site when they may have to drive 30 minutes or an hour to get to a site. I would say those are the most common. I do want to add in with employers that feel like they're having a higher drug problem than what they're actually seeing with their particular statistics. We've had a few employers that moved toward oral fluid and have actually seen more positivity rate and creating that safer workforce.
We're also getting a few questions about alcohol and if oral fluid testing can measure alcohol and if that needs to be a separate test from a traditional drug screen panel.
Okay, what we talked about today was laboratory oral fluid drugs of abuse testing, but there is oral fluid alcohol testing. It's a separate test. Even the DOT, the federally mandated testing, allows for oral fluid alcohol testing. So it is a saliva strip that you can put in your mouth, and it can test starting at a 0.02 level and above for screening purposes. So yes, you can do alcohol through oral fluid. It is just a separate test.
Great. There's a question about where do we find out if this testing is acceptable in their state of residence?
Well, one thing I want to mention is I'm not an attorney and I don't want to get into too much legal things, but with our attorneys here, one thing we always talk to our clients about is making sure you talk to your legal counsel. Your legal counsel needs to be up to date with your policies and all the laws that are out there for each state. So first, you need to check with your own attorneys to make sure that they can educate you on those things. And we are always glad to help your attorneys with our attorneys, getting them together to help with those type of questions if they need some additional resources.
Now, is oral fluid testing something that can be facilitated in the workplace by the HR representative, or does it need to be done in a laboratory?
Yes, it can be done. and I'm going to stress, we were talking about laboratory oral fluid testing here. And commonly with our clients, we have seen either the HR representative or the safety director or safety personnel that typically does those. We've had a few employers that have supervisors do it, but the more control you have over that, the better. So it's typically done by HR or the safety department.
Okay, our next question is oral fluid testing less costly than urine testing? Would you suggest that employers use that to save costs when testing non-DOT employees?
Yes, it can be less costly. And I say that because the collection fees that are involved with typical urine and hair testing, those can be exorbitant. So oral fluid in most cases is going to be cheaper than urine or hair testing. Hair testing is a lot more expensive, but urine testing, I would say it's even less expensive than that typically.
Does oral fluid show impairment at the time of testing?
That's a good question, Alexis. We get that question a lot, and one thing we cannot do in drug testing today is show impairment. I always go back to like alcohol testing. If you have a breath alcohol instrument or it's a state trooper or things like that, they can check for impairment using that breath alcohol testing. Drugs, you can't do that to this date simply because there's so many factors that come into play. So unfortunately, you can't test for impairment, but one advantage of oral fluid testing is being the closest thing that you can have as far as testing to impairment. So if you remember back early in the presentation, we talked about the windows of detection. So if someone uses drugs recently after ingestion up to 24 to 48 hours, you're looking at very recent use. So if they do marijuana, cocaine, or any of the other drugs, and they are impaired, you're going to be more likely to catch it with the oral fluid test than you would a urine or hair test. And that's just because it takes about a day to get in a urine sample, and obviously taking a week to get in a hair test. That's not really looking for impairment at all.
What types of tests is oral fluid testing good for?
I would say, and the DOT again is looking to approve this to get it into place. I'm going to say next year or so, but things we've heard from the DOT that have done a lot of studies and all, and research we've seen through our testing with our clients. We have seen that oral fluid testing is good for reasonable suspicion, post-accidents, and even some random testing. Pre-employment testing, it's used for that a lot with job fairs and things like that. It's easy to use and things like that. But in our industry, we call a pre-employment test like an intelligence test for oral fluid test, because they would have had to be doing drugs on the way or very recently to be caught. So we call it an intelligence test.
These have all been great questions, and we have one more. Is there a split sample collection like with a urine test?
That's a good question. The typical procedures for oral fluid testing does just use one sample, but the DOT, from the things that I've heard, would require split sample testing. So we've already had clients that have put that process in place. So we have our collectors, instead of collecting one sample, they're actually collecting the two samples, and it's in two different containers with two labels on it to have that same split sample process. And to talk about split samples a little bit more in depth for those that may not be familiar with it, in split sample testing, bottle A or vial A is used. We call it the employer bottle because that's the one the laboratory is going to open up and do the testing on. Bottle B, we consider the donor's bottle. So if the donor thinks that the laboratory has made a mistake, they can ask the MRO to have that second sample, which is still sealed, sent to a totally different laboratory and tested again to make sure that there wasn't a mistake done by the initial laboratory. So the answer is yes, you can collect a split sample with oral fluid testing.
We just had a couple more questions come in. So how would we get the testing materials to do on-site drug testing?
Through your third-party administrator. For us, we do all that for the clients. I will just, I'm an open and honest person, so I'm just going to forewarn you. Depending on the laboratories you use, there may be a cost for the actual device. So if you order maybe 20 to 25 devices, the laboratory or the third-party administrator may charge you a fee just for the device. But there may be there are some laboratories that may not charge a fee for that device and just include it with the testing itself. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But your third-party administrator should order all those for you. I'm sure you could order those directly from the laboratory, but just like you do with urine testing or hair testing now, supplies are done exactly the same way. The laboratory is going to ship those out to you. The only difference is there is an expiration date, so you have to be more mindful of how many you're using and what the expiration dates are.
All right. And then this question relates to student drug testing. For large numbers of students, potentially over 100, would there be potential issues for test administrators or cause delays in the result times?
No, absolutely not. And I'll say that with the caveat of most of our schools do on-site testing, so we have people that come on site to facilitate everything and collect the samples and send them off. And usually the school is just responsible for having someone on site just to make sure the students are coming and things like that. If the facilitator at the school wants to do it themselves, it's definitely possible, and we can train them to do it and try to get them as proficient as possible. But no, as long as you have enough collectors, we haven't seen any delays because we send enough collectors to accommodate getting the large number of students taken care of in a timely fashion. Now, with that being said, if the school has one facilitator trying to do over 100 students, that's not really practical. But, if we send out 4 collectors, we can do 100 students in, an hour or so, just for lack of a better example. So, yes, we can collect them quickly. We get them sent into the laboratory. Laboratory procedures are the same, so there's no delays with the time frame on getting the results. And we monitor those results to make sure that they're getting back and being tracked and so forth.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Scott. And thank all of you for attending today. If you have any additional questions, we will respond to those via email, or if you think of something later, you can always reach out to us at webinar@es2.com, and we will get Scott or a team member to answer that and send it your way. We will also be sending the slides and a link to the recording of today's webinar via email tomorrow, so just keep an eye out for that. And again, thank you all so much for attending, and we hope you found the session informative.